April 17th, 1945. The air over Nuremberg hung thick with ash and stone dust. In the rubble of what had once been a bakery on Königstrasse, a 12-year-old girl named Liesel Hoffmann crouched beside her mother, watching American soldiers move through the devastated streets. The spring sun broke through the smoke in pale yellow shafts, illuminating faces that hadn't seen clean food in months. When a young GI stopped before them, his uniform impossibly clean against the grey devastation, and placed a brown rectangular package in Liesel's trembling hands, she stared at it as though he'd handed her a bar of gold. It was chocolate. Real chocolate. The kind that existed only in her grandmother's pre-war stories. She broke off a corner, placed it on her tongue, and in that single moment of sweetness dissolving against her palate, everything she'd been told about the Americans, the barbaric destroyers, the crude materialists, the enemies of civilization began to crumble like the buildings around her. This was the chocolate shock. Not the conquest of German cities, not the thunder of Allied tanks rolling through the Brandenburg Gate, but something far more subversive and profound. It was the moment when ordinary German civilians, starved and broken after 6 years of total war, encountered the staggering material abundance of American life made manifest in the simple generosity of soldiers who carried more food in their field packs than entire German families had seen in weeks. Between April and July of 1945, as American forces occupied the western zones of defeated Germany, millions of German civilians experienced a cognitive rupture that propaganda could never have prepared them for. They had been conditioned to see Americans as culturally inferior, as mongrel democracies lacking the spiritual depth and martial discipline of the Third Reich. What they discovered instead, in chocolate bars and sea rations, in chewing gum and cigarettes, in white bread and canned meat, was an empire of plenty that operated on principles they couldn't begin to comprehend. This abundance wasn't the spoils of recent conquest. It was baseline. It was what every American soldier carried as standard issue. And it rewrote everything. To understand the depth of this shock, we must first understand what German civilians expected. For 12 years, the Nazi propaganda machine had constructed an elaborate narrative about America and Americans. In the pages of Der Stürmer and in the weekly newsreels that played before every film, America was depicted as a nation in terminal decline, a mongrel civilization corrupted by Jewish influence, Negro music, and democratic weakness. German schoolchildren learned that American soldiers were poorly trained, undisciplined, motivated only by materialistic greed rather than ideological conviction. The standard propaganda image showed American troops as soft, dependent on their machinery, lacking the hardness and spiritual commitment that supposedly defined the German warrior. According to Joseph Goebbels' broadcasts, which millions of Germans heard throughout the war, America was a paper tiger rich in resources perhaps, but morally bankrupt, incapable of sustaining a long war against the disciplined forces of National Socialism. By early 1945, as the war turned catastrophically against Germany, this propaganda had evolved into something darker and more desperate. The German population, especially in cities targeted for Allied bombing, was repeatedly warned that American and British forces would show no mercy. Drawing on memories of the harsh conditions imposed after World War I, Nazi officials painted vivid pictures of what American occupation would mean: mass executions, systematic rape, starvation as policy, the complete destruction of German culture. In towns across Western Germany, as American forces approached, local Nazi officials sometimes urged civilians to flee eastward or even to commit suicide rather than face the coming American barbarism. In Berlin, in the bunker's final days, Hitler himself ranted about the primitive brutality that awaited Germans under American rule, insisting that death was preferable to such degradation. The reality they encountered was something entirely different. When the American 7th Army entered Heidelberg on March 30th, 1945, the city that had tensed for massacre found instead soldiers handing out food. When the Third Army liberated the Buchenwald concentration camp on April 11th, starving prisoners received not just liberation, but immediate medical care and rations that exceeded what German civilians had eaten in years. And when American forces occupied Nuremberg in April, after weeks of brutal urban combat that left the medieval city in ruins, the same soldiers who had fought building by building began distributing food to the civilian population within hours of the fighting's end. This wasn't magnanimity. It was policy. It was who they were. The standard American field ration of World War II was a marvel of industrial production and nutritional science. The C ration, introduced in 1938 and refined throughout the war, contained 3 cans, one with meat and vegetables, one with bread or biscuits, and one with dessert, typically fruit or pudding. Each ration provided approximately 3,000 calories, far more than the average German civilian was receiving by war's end. The K ration, designed for paratroopers and mobile units, was even more compact and calorie-dense. But the real revelation wasn't the rations themselves, it was what accompanied them. Every American soldier carried supplemental items that seemed to German observers almost fantastical in their abundance. Hershey's D-ration chocolate bars, designed to survive extreme conditions. Wrigley's chewing gum, sticks of it, distributed casually to children in the streets. Camel cigarettes, whole cartons carried as personal supplies. Instant coffee, white sugar, canned Spam, peanut butter. Items that had vanished from German civilian life by 1942, if they'd ever existed there at all, were casual accessories in every American rucksack. The German reaction to this abundance left witnesses in both populations stunned by its intensity. In Stuttgart, when American forces arrived in late April, military government officer Captain John Thompson recorded in his diary his astonishment at watching German women weep over C-ration, cans of peaches in heavy syrup. They handled the cans like religious relics, he wrote. One woman kept repeating, "Impossible. Impossible," as she stared at the label showing the peach halves in golden liquid. She couldn't comprehend that this was food for common soldiers, not officers. That every man in our unit had access to such things. In Frankfurt, a Red Cross worker named Margaret Burrows described German children mobbing American trucks not with violence, but with desperate pleading, hands, outstretched, the word chocolade repeated like an incantation. She noted, a single Hershey bar could buy information, cooperation, sometimes even silence about former Nazi activities. But mostly the children just wanted to taste the sweetness again. The diary of Martha Gellhorn, the war correspondent who travelled with American forces through Germany in April and May of 1945, contains perhaps the most vivid account of this collision between expectation and reality. Writing from a displaced persons camp near Munich, she described watching a group of German women, former secretaries, teachers, housewives from good families sorting through American garbage for food waste. They were mortified to be seen, Gellhorn wrote. But hunger had broken something in them. What shocked them most, they told me, wasn't that they were scavenging. It was what the Americans threw away. Half-eaten chocolate bars. Bread that wasn't even stale. Cigarettes barely smoked. Cans of fruit with only a few spoonfuls taken. One woman said to me, "They throw away more food in a day than my family ate in a week. How can such people exist? How can they not understand what they have?" But this incomprehension worked both ways. American soldiers, most of them young men from working class and farming backgrounds, found themselves bewildered by German reactions to what they considered basic supplies. Private Harold Radish, from Cleveland, attached to the Third Army, wrote home in May of 1945, describing an encounter in a small Bavarian village. "I gave a kid a chocolate bar and he ran home screaming like I'd given him $1 million. Half an hour later his whole family shows up wanting to thank me. The old man actually tried to give me this antique clock that has probably been in his family for generations. I tried to explain we got boxes of these things, but they just stared at me like I was lying, made me feel weird about eating one ever again." The chocolate became symbolic, but it was part of a larger revelation about American material culture that German civilians simply couldn't process through their existing ideological framework. The Nazi worldview had positioned Germany as culturally superior, precisely because Germans supposedly valued spiritual and cultural achievements over crass materialism. The German people, they'd been told, were deeper, more philosophical, willing to endure hardship for higher ideals. Americans were the opposite, shallow, obsessed with comfort and convenience, lacking in soul. But here were these supposedly shallow materialists, these cultural inferiors, distributing their abundance freely, seemingly without thought, while German civilization lay in ruins. The cognitive dissonance was profound. If Americans were so inferior, so morally bankrupt, why were they feeding their enemies? And if American democracy was so weak, so inefficient, how had it produced such staggering wealth that even its common soldiers lived better than German officers? The rations revealed something else, too, something about the nature of American industrial capacity that shattered another pillar of Nazi ideology. The Third Reich had glorified handcraft, traditional methods, and the artisanal approach to everything from weapons to food. There was supposed to be virtue in doing things the hard way, the old way. American mass production, by contrast, had been mocked as soulless, producing quantity without quality, flooding the world with cheap goods that lacked the excellence of German engineering. But when German civilians opened those sea ration cans, they found food of startling quality, meat that was tender, fruit perfectly preserved, chocolate smooth and rich. These weren't inferior products hastily manufactured. They were engineered to perfection, produced in quantities that seemed almost supernatural, and delivered to the front lines of a global war with casual efficiency. The American supply chain, operating across 2 oceans, keeping millions of soldiers fed and equipped, represented an organizational achievement that made pre-war German boasts about efficiency ring hollow. Documents from the United States Army's Civil Affairs Division, declassified in the 1970s, reveal just how systematically this abundance was deployed. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, under General Eisenhower, had planned for the humanitarian crisis they would face in occupied Germany. The plan, coded Eclipse, allocated specific tonnages of food aid per capita for German civilians, calculated to prevent starvation while remaining below the rations provided to liberated nations. But on the ground, individual American soldiers routinely exceeded these guidelines, sharing their personal rations out of what observers repeatedly described as either casual generosity or simple inability to understand the desperation around them. A military government report from June 1945 noted with some frustration that American personnel continued to distribute chocolate, cigarettes, and other luxury items to German civilians, despite instructions to maintain professional distance. The natural generosity of the American soldier, while admirable, complicates efforts to maintain appropriate occupational protocols. For many German women, especially those in the devastated cities, the chocolate became entangled with survival strategies that carried their own moral weight. The term Ami Liebchen, American sweetheart, entered German vocabulary in those months, describing women who formed relationships, temporary or lasting, with American soldiers. Some of these relationships were genuine affection born of proximity and shared humanity. Many were straightforward transactions, sex for chocolate, for cigarettes, for stockings, for meat. The morality of these arrangements was and remains complex, existing in that grey zone between choice and coercion that emerges when one population has everything and another has nothing. But what's undeniable is that American abundance made these relationships possible and shaped them. A woman in Hamburg could feed her children for a week on what she could obtain from a single night with an American soldier. The chocolate wasn't just food, it was the visible symbol of an economic disparity so vast it created its own moral universe. The American military, aware of this dynamic, attempted various responses. Some units instituted strict non-fraternization policies, forbidding personal contact between American soldiers and German civilians. These policies proved largely unenforceable and were officially relaxed by July 1945. More successful were efforts to establish formal food distribution systems reducing the power differential that made chocolate into currency. But even as organized relief operations scaled up, the fundamental reality remained: Americans had things, casually and abundantly, that Germans would have killed for. And Germans were forced to reconcile this reality with everything they'd been taught about American inferiority. The children of that era, now in their 80s and 90s, often recall the chocolate with an intensity that transcends mere nostalgia for childhood sweets. In oral histories collected by German universities in the 1990s and 2000s, a consistent pattern emerges. The chocolate represented their first understanding that adults could lie, that everything they'd been taught might be false. "I was 7, recalled one woman, formerly of Dresden, now living in Hamburg. "A black American soldier gave me chocolate. I'd been taught that black people were subhuman, dangerous, to be feared. But he smiled at me and gave me chocolate. Real chocolate. It broke something in my head. If they'd lied about him, what else was a lie?" Another man, who was 10 when American forces occupied his town near Frankfurt, remembered. "The chocolate tasted like the future. Does that make sense? It tasted like everything was going to be different now." And it was. Everything was different. The symbolic power of American food extended beyond immediate survival needs into questions of identity and values. Germans had been taught to take pride in austerity, in the ability to endure hardship without complaint. This was presented as a virtue that separated them from soft, pleasure-seeking democracies. But the American abundance suggested a different value system entirely, one in which prosperity wasn't suspicious, where comfort wasn't weakness, where having enough to share with your enemies wasn't decadence but strength. The message encoded in every chocolate bar was simple and devastating. Democracy works. It produces wealth, and that wealth can be generated without conquest, without enslaving other nations, without the brutal hierarchies the Third Reich had insisted were necessary for prosperity. By summer of 1945, as the occupation solidified and the reality of Germany's total defeat became impossible to deny, a new word entered common German usage: Fresswell, literally, eating wave. It described the German population's obsessive preoccupation with food, discussing it, dreaming about it, hoarding whatever could be found. But it also described a deeper hunger, a recognition that they'd been starved not just of calories but of truth. The American rations had revealed the lie at the heart of Nazi ideology. Germany hadn't been defeated by warriors more committed, more spiritually pure, more willing to sacrifice. They'd been defeated by an industrial democracy so efficient, so wealthy, so casually abundant that it could afford to be generous to its defeated enemies. The chocolate said, "You were wrong about everything." The transformation this created wasn't immediate or universal. Some Germans remained bitter, resentful, clinging to fragments of the old ideology even as they accepted American food. Others simply recalibrated, transferring their need for authority from failed Nazi leadership to the occupation government. But for many, especially the young, the chocolate initiated a longer process of rethinking. If Americans weren't the cultural inferiors they'd been portrayed as, what else might be true? If democracy could produce such abundance, might it be worth trying? If generosity, rather than conquest, could be a source of power, what did that say about the values Germany should embrace? The Marshall Plan, announced in June of 1947, would formalize and expand what the chocolate bars had begun the use of American abundance as a tool of reconstruction and ideological transformation. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States poured over $13 billion into Western European recovery, a substantial portion going to Germany. The chocolate bars of April 1945 were the vanguard of this strategy, demonstrating not through propaganda but through tangible experience that American capitalism could generate wealth on a scale the German population had never imagined. Where Nazi ideology had promised prosperity through conquest and racial hierarchy, American democracy delivered it through industrial efficiency and, at least in theory, through systems that valued productivity over breeding. but it would be too simple to say that chocolate and chewing gum transformed German political consciousness overnight. The process was longer, more complex, tangled with Cold War pressures and the practical necessities of reconstruction. What the rations did accomplish was more subtle. They made American ideas plausible. When American military government officers began establishing democratic institutions in occupied Germany, when they brought in educators to redesign the school system, when they restructured the economy along free market lines, Germans who'd tasted Hershey's chocolate and eaten C-ration peaches could believe that maybe, possibly, these strange American ideas about freedom and prosperity might actually work. The chocolate didn't convince them that democracy was morally superior. It convinced them that democracy was practically effective. And for a population exhausted by ideology, that was perhaps more persuasive. The symbolic power of those chocolate bars rippled forward through decades. The Berlin airlift of 1948 to 49, when American and British planes supplied blockaded West Berlin, included Operation Little Victuals, pilots dropping handkerchief parachutes laden with candy to Berlin children. The image of American bombers, which had devastated German cities, now bringing chocolate and hope, became iconic. It said, "We were enemies, but we don't have to be. We have enough to share. Our system produces abundance not just for ourselves, but potentially for you too." For the generation of Germans who experienced the chocolate shock, the memory remained visceral. In a 1998 interview, the historian Fritz Stern, who'd fled Nazi Germany as a Jewish refugee in 1938 and returned with American forces in 1945, reflected on this phenomenon. The chocolate was forgiveness made edible. That's what Germans couldn't understand at first. In their framework, enemies didn't feed you. Conquerors took resources. They didn't distribute them. The idea that Americans would give food to people who'd been trying to kill them just months before it violated everything they thought they knew about power. But that's what democracies do differently. They can afford generosity because their wealth isn't zero-sum. Learning that lesson was Germany's real re-education. The chocolate shock wasn't unique to Germany. Similar scenes played out in Austria, in Italy, in Japan. Wherever American forces occupied former enemy territory, their casual abundance produced the same cognitive dissonance, the same slow recognition that the propagandists had lied. But in Germany, the shock was perhaps most profound because the propaganda had been most systematic, the ideological investment most total. Germans hadn't just been told Americans were enemies. They'd been taught that the entire American system was inferior, that democracy itself was a failed experiment. The chocolate said otherwise. Every Hershey bar was a small advertisement for capitalism, every stick of gum a tiny missionary for democratic values. By the time Liesl Hoffmann reached her 70s, living in a peaceful, prosperous Federal Republic of Germany, she'd built a career as a teacher, raised children, seen her country transformed almost beyond recognition. But she never forgot that first taste of American chocolate in the ruins of Nuremberg, how impossibly sweet it was, how it seemed to carry in its flavor the promise of a different kind of world. In a letter to her granddaughter, written shortly before her death in 2003, she reflected, "That soldier who gave me chocolate couldn't have known what he was doing. For him, it was just being kind to a hungry child. But for me, it was the moment when the war truly ended. Not when the guns stopped, but when I understood that our enemies were better than we'd been told. Not American, but free." The chocolate tasted like that possibility. The great irony, of course, is that chocolate itself, real chocolate, had been one of the luxuries the Third Reich had promised Germans once victory was achieved. The propaganda had painted visions of prosperity that would follow triumph, of living standards that would exceed even America's once German arms had conquered the necessary resources. But victory never came. The prosperity never materialized. Instead, it arrived with defeat, carried in the pockets of enemy soldiers who couldn't comprehend why German children were so desperate for simple candy. In the end, the chocolate shock was about more than food. It was about the collision of two worldviews, two systems, two ways of organizing human society. On one side, Nazi Germany, militaristic, hierarchical, organized around principles of conquest and racial domination, promising abundance through victory but delivering only destruction and scarcity. On the other hand, democratic America, flawed certainly, racist in its own ways, far from the ideals it proclaimed, but capable of generating wealth on a scale that made even its foot soldiers agents of empire. The chocolate said, "Our system works better than yours. Not morally better necessarily, though Americans believed that too. But practically, measurably, tangibly better. It produces more. And more matters when you're starving." April 17th, 1945. A girl in ruins holds a chocolate bar and tastes sweetness for the first time in years. In that moment, everything changes, even if she doesn't understand it yet. The chocolate melts on her tongue, brown and smooth and impossibly rich, and the world it represents, abundant, generous, strange, begins to seem not like propaganda's lie, but like a possible future. Not because of speeches or ideology or high-minded principles, but because of what her senses tell her, cannot be denied. This exists, this is real, they have it, and we don't. Perhaps, if we're very lucky, very humble, if we accept that we were wrong about everything we thought we knew, we can have it too. The chocolate says there is enough, if only you'll join the world that knows how to create enough, rather than trying to steal it. The chocolate, in its small brown square, contains all of that. It takes years to understand, but it starts with sweetness, in the ruins, on an April afternoon when the war is ending and everything is about to change.